I was completely in love with it from the minute I opened the page.
I went into the bedroom to smoke a joint. I lit it up and I turned around and there's John Lennon sitting on the floor.
That's what every writer is shooting for, is that number one slot, and it's terrific to have landed there.
This is Off the Shelf and on your radio.
Joni Mitchell's landmark album, Blue, has become a rite of passage for generations of young people. Nearly 4 decades after its release, it continues to sell 40,000 copies each year. In Will You Take Me As I Am, Joni Mitchell's Blue Period, music journalist and NPR contributor Michelle Mercer explores the development of this extraordinary artist and tracks the significance of blue in our lives and culture. Will You Take Me As I Am addresses what you call Joni Mitchell's Blue Period. What is her Blue Period?
It's what I call her largely autobiographical period in her career, and it sort of started in the early 70s with the Blue album and went through to the mid-70s. And for the majority of fans, I think that's when she created some of their most beloved work of hers and some of her most, enduringly popular songs. And, I love her later work with jazz musicians and her other experiments in world music. But I was interested in this period because she came to bare herself so nakedly during this time. And I was curious to know just how that came about and how that affected her.
A lot of people think of Joni Mitchell as the queen of confessional songwriting. But you say Mitchell's work is autobiographical, not confessional. What's the difference?
Well, people had always used this term with regard to her, and she hates this term. And so I decided to sort of dig into it and figure out exactly what confessional songwriting means. So I went back and traced the history of confessional literature, back to Augustine, St. Augustine's Confessions, through Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, and sort of figured out that at first I wanted to use the term confessional songwriting, but I came to see that Joni's sort of displeasure with the term makes a lot of sense, because confessional sort of implies that you're spilling the truth about yourself under some kind of duress. And autobiography, which is a better term for what Joni does, implies that she's trying to she's telling stories about herself and often revealing a lot about herself, but her main objective is a poet's objective, and that's to find and tell human truths.
Even though Blue has been incredibly cathartic for thousands of people, the period of recording the album was terribly unhappy for Mitchell herself. Why was that?
Well, yeah, that's the strange irony of the album. She created this album that people could use as therapy, and people have even said things to her over the years, like, before we had Prozac, we had you, Joni. But at the same time, right after she recorded it, she needed therapy herself, and in fact went into therapy for the first time. And she said that she just laid too much of herself bare on the album and was very nervous about that. I mean, after Chris Christopherson heard the album, he said famously, "Jesus, Joni, save something for yourself." Today, it's a little bit difficult for me at least, to think back to a time before people had laid themselves bare in books, because we live in such a confessional period. The period of the memoir has happened since 1971 when Blue was recorded. And
there was no reality TV then either.
Yeah, or talk shows, for example. But at that time, it was revelatory what she was saying in those songs. And even just saying, "I love you some, I hate you some, I love you some," when I forget about me. People hadn't said expressed that kind of ambiguity or truthfulness in song before. And so what happened was she basically decided that she was ready to retire from the music industry, and she went up to Canada and built herself a house on British Columbia's Sunshine Coast with the intention of staying there forever. And in that time, she she said that she felt like she kind of needed to get back to the garden, which she had encouraged everyone to do in her famous song Woodstock. And she said that's what she kind of did for herself during that time and figured a lot of things out. So that's what happened. But it's always been a very, very interesting to me, this irony of so many people using this album as therapy, but she needed therapy herself after she recorded it.
In terms of influences, a lot of people have been influenced by the album, but she is also influenced, you said, a lot by the landscape. She was raised in Saskatchewan, and you said that has a lot to do with the sound of her music. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's one of those things that we always read in, or I've always read in music reviews. Reviews of Joni Mitchell's music, reviews of Neil Young's music. They, both grew up in the prairies of Canada, and people would say, of course, there's a prairie sound, there's a panoramic sound in their music, and I never quite knew what that meant, and so I decided to look into that. And if you look at Joni's song "Both Sides Now," she's in a way using the landscape to put forth this poetic conceit of looking at love and life from both sides, not just clouds, but love and life in the song. And, when she recorded that song, she was very young, only 22, and people asked her, how could you have that kind of mature perspective on life at such a young age? And she says that some people even saw it as fraudulent. And my explanation is that because she grew up there in Saskatchewan, where the flat land and the big sky can encourage its residents to take a broad view. Where she grew up, I visited the town that she grew up in, Maidstone, in Saskatchewan, and then also Saskatoon. There's nothing to break up the vast expanse of sky. There's nothing there, and you just have to create the landscape into being. And I think that has, for a creative girl like Joni Mitchell, who also, had the unfortunate experience of contracting polio and was bedridden for a while, I think that growing up in that environment definitely had a lot to do with her becoming such a poet as a songwriter, and then creating music itself that was so evocative of the landscape.
Are there particular songs that you think demonstrate where her tuning is unique?
Yes. I think the entire Blue album, for example, which uses a number of unique tunings, derives its power of expression from the fact that she was almost using music in the way that a painter uses a palette, and just painting colors of whatever emotional expression that she needed with chords. And definitely that is the case on Blue. Every song on Blue just rings out with emotion and feeling, and that's because her music is purely expressionistic. And then also I think the album Hejira also has a lot of that quality as well. If she says, I was driving through the burning desert, you can actually see and feel the burning desert in the music. And
you call the album kind of a bookend to Blue. Why is that?
Well, it's interesting because after Blue, Joni, which she recorded in 1971, Joni began to move away from personal autobiographical songwriting to a certain degree. She began to work with a jazz band, the LA Express, and she began to write songs that in which the lyrics really had more to do with social commentary than personal revelation. But then she went on the Rolling Thunder Review with Bob Dylan and Sam Shepard and Joan Baez and all of these sort of extravagant personalities. And she, at the same time, suffered a bad breakup, and it sort of made her want to retreat into herself again. And so she went out on a trip on her own in 1976, following the Rolling Thunder Review tour, And, just as she had 6 years before, she had, been fleeing a failed love affair with Graham Nash, and she was trying on hippie freedom for size. And a lot of that comes through on the album Blue. 6 years later, when she was writing Hejira, she was fleeing another bad breakup, this time with drummer John Guerin, and she went on this transcontinental trip through the country. And by then, I think that she was a little more ruminative than she had been before. She also had a very important meeting with a Tibetan Lama, Chogyam Trungpa, and that affected her greatly. She tells a great story about that. And she met this Lama in Colorado on this trip, and I don't know what he did exactly. And actually, the way she tells it, it's very fantastical. But he put her in a state where she sort of lost her self-consciousness, and she even says she lost her sense of I, the pronoun itself, for 3 days. And so what all this added up to was this sense of Joni being in the same situation she'd been in 6 years before when she was recording Blue, but having a new perspective on love, on its pleasures and its failures. And so basically on the album Blue, in the song California, she asked, "Will you take me as I am?" And I think at that point she was still sort of looking for somebody to do that, as she asked that in the song famously. And by the time she recorded Hejira in 1976, she had found a way to embrace herself. She had found a way to take herself as she was, and she'd learned some degree of self-acceptance. And since she had found that, she kind of didn't need to write her way into self-understanding anymore. And that kind of effectively put an end to her autobiographical period, or what I call her Blue period. Before that, she had, after that, she would go on to write autobiographical songs, but it wasn't out of the sense of the necessity of self-understanding. But I think that necessity of self-understanding is what makes this Blue period so enduringly popular.
I know that you concentrate on the music, not necessarily what's happening in her romantic life, but she was involved with some, very famous musicians, from Graham Nash to Leonard Cohen to James Taylor. And I'm curious how her involvement with them affected her music. For example, what did she learn from Leonard Cohen? What did they teach one another?
Well, when she met Leonard Cohen, she was very young. It was 1967 or perhaps 68, and she had just come out of a bad marriage, her first marriage, to Chuck Mitchell. And Joni, for all of her brilliance, has always felt a bit like she was the dumb kid in the class because she had some trouble with math and science courses in high school.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. And so she met Leonard Cohen, and Leonard Cohen at that time was just emerging as a songwriter, yet he was already established as a writer of fiction and poetry. And so she asked him to give her a reading list, and he told her to read the I Ching and Lorca, the poet, and a number of other people, and really gave her an education. And at that time, Leonard's poetry was very much in the autobiographical mode. I think it kind of always has been that way. But at the time, it was very autobiographical. And I think Leonard showed Joni just how deeply she could plumb her experiences and render them into lyrics. I think then later on, they broke up, and Joni, for a long time, seemed to move through men and sort of pick up whatever she could from them artistically and then sort of transcend them artistically. And that was her modus operandi for a number of years. I think later on, Leonard Cohen, in listening to Joni, learned how to relate music to lyrics in a significant way. If you listen to his song Hallelujah, for example.
I love that song.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. It's great, and it works in so many different movie soundtracks. It's amazing. I'm always glad to hear it. But you hear him say the major fall, the minor fall, the major lift, the fourth, the fifth, and in those lyrics. And musically, what's happening actually is a reflection of what he's saying in the lyrics at the time. And that's the kind of thing that I think a lot of songwriters have learned from Joni Mitchell.
Aside from former lovers, in the book you mentioned that there are several musicians that you've heard talk over the years that have been really influenced by her. Could you just name a couple of them?
Someone as prominent as Madonna, for example, has given it up to Joni and said that, she's completely unparalleled in her songwriting, and that she came of age listening to albums like Court and Spark. Annie Lennox has given it up to Joni. Prince famously was, hanging out as a 16-year-old in the front row of a Joni Mitchell concert, just gazing up at her with adoration. Definitely there's falling in love with Joni's music is a coming-of-age experience, not just for civilians, but for some of the great musical artists of our time, too.
Thanks, Michelle, for joining us on Off the Shelf. Will You Take Me As I Am is published by Free Press. To find out more about the book or Michelle Mercer, go to www.simonandschuster.com.